Why, hello there. My name is Corbin, and this is this is my intro for my first real, concrete, scripted video about an actual topic. And yeah, I'm doing it about one of my favorite movies of recent times called Midsommar by a director called Ari Aster, who's made some amazing hits in the past, such as Strange Thing About the Johnsons. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. You should definitely watch it if you haven't seen it. It's amazing. But we're here to talk about Midsommar. And I've got quite a bit to say about this movie. It's probably going to be a three-parter. But yeah, let's get into it. I'm excited. Here we go. There's a theme in the movie Midsommar about emotional closeness and the power of good emotional communication that I think may get a bit overshadowed, perhaps, by, how can I put this? All the other shit going on in the movie. And I think this theme deserves to be explored because, well, Midsummer does justifiably fall under the horror genre, usually. Nothing in it is, strictly speaking, unrealistic. And that's because I think what the filmmakers were trying to do was highlight the benefits of good emotional communication by showing us just an absolute, like, nightmare, worst case scenario of the consequences of, like, messing it up. And I think they certainly accomplished their goal there. So yeah, this movie starts out with two protagonists in a pretty relatable situation. We have a girlfriend, Danny, and a boyfriend, Christian. These two are in a bit of what we might call a codependent relationship. Danny is relying heavily on Christian for her emotional support and well-being. She feels like her emotions are too strong for her to deal with by herself and is thus afraid of letting go of Christian. She's also worried, though, that she's overwhelming Christian with her neediness. Christian, meanwhile, is feeling uninterested in the relationship but is unable to end it because he doesn't want to have to go through the emotional hassle of upending his entire life and routine. And since he's uninterested in the relationship but won't remove himself from it, he's unable to give Danny the emotional support she needs and ends up taking out some of his anger at himself on her. And since Danny is unable to meaningfully stand up for herself because she's terrified of losing Christian, she allows him to treat her this way and doesn't break up with him like he wants. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the very real and painfully relatable beginning that we find our characters in. There's nothing surreal about this situation. Yet. Very soon we have the first cruel twist of fate. Danny's bipolar sister murders their parents as well as herself in a depressive episode. When tragic events like this happen in the real world, like, obviously we turn to the people we have left for aid in the healing process. Likewise, Danny turns to Christian, the closest relationship that she has left. Christian, meanwhile, who had been contemplating ending the relationship literally moments before finding out this terrible news, finds himself suddenly trapped by the moral impetus to not abandon Danny at such a terrible time in her life. And thus the wrench begins to turn on this floundering, codependent relationship. Things do not improve between the two after this. Surprise, surprise. Danny's emotions are even more unstable now, but she continues to bottle them up because Christian does not respond well to them. not wanting or knowing how to deal with them, he subtly encourages her to just, take them away from him. Yeah. And since he's really all she has, she effectively has no one to be emotionally honest with. Christian feels trapped in the relationship indefinitely, while Danny is drowning in her own grief with no one truly helping her through it. So, after another pretty terrible stroke of bad luck, one of the members of the Christian's friend group turns out to be secretly from an insane Swedish commune, which sends its young people across the world to lure other young people home for sacrifice and recruitment purposes. Again, unlikely, but not impossible. I, re- I really think this is just like the filmmakers finding a creative way to like increase the pressure on Danny and Christian's relationship, just to like see how and when it breaks. And this particular method, I gotta say, is like pretty genius for that, because the way they end up using it to sort of emphasize the faults of their relationship is amazing. I'll get into that later on. But anyway, so this guy Pelle, the charming Swedish friend, convinces his group to come visit his commune for their Midsommar celebration in order to, show them around his culture, introduce them to his homeland. So, Christian's group is all into it, and after some pretty hilarious and depressing scenes where Christian, like, doesn't tell Danny about the trip until after he buys the ticket, and then Danny calls him out on it, but ends up apologizing to him when he gets mad, and then Christian just ends up inviting her on the trip out of guilt. Just great emotional illiteracy that's very uncomfortable to watch. So, Danny and the boys go to Sweden, and it's all according to this guy Pelle's plan, who has seen the dysfunction of Danny's relationship and her torment after losing her family, and like any other upstanding dude, he just wants to, use that as a means of converting her to his cult. And the other guys in his group, just a great source of sacrificial meat, It is how it is. So, yeah. Once they're in Sweden, we kind of chill out on the insane, cruel twists of fate for a while. And the characters just get to be themselves for a bit. They're greeted by, like, these super nice, polite commune members who just go out of their way to welcome them and make them feel at home. And meanwhile, like, Christian's over here, like, forgetting Danny's birthday and just casually responding to the native girls, like, flirting with him. And Danny's, like, just refusing to get mad at him no matter what he does. And meanwhile, Pelle is, like, trying to slide in as well because he kind of likes her, and he kind of feels like he might want to keep her around instead of killing her and sacrificing her like all his other friends, And then we have a very traumatic incident for both character and viewer. The out-of-towners are treated to this ceremony that they are not warned about at all. Like, the natives do not tell them what the ceremony is going to be. They're just like, hey, it's a cool ceremony, you should come watch it. And the ceremony ends up being that this group's village elders are, like, committing ritual suicide by jumping off of a cliff, like, hundreds of feet high. And, the main characters are just surprised with it. No warning at all, Warnings are for, I don't know, lame people. Now, I think this was supposed to be, like, a manipulation tactic used by the commune to sort of thin out their new recruits by exposing who's willing to go along with things like this more than others. But that may just be me making excuses for the movie. I'm not really sure. And either way, I'm more here to talk about themes than, I guess, like, review everything I did and didn't like about the movie, but whatever. But anyway, Danny is like understandably horrified as she sees the results of a old human body like splatting against hard stone after like a several 100-foot drop. And it definitely uncovers some of her trauma about losing her parents. She kind of goes into shock afterwards, not being able to say anything and voice her anguish. Now, Christian is also horrified and he kind of walks around in shock, but notably, they do not look to each other for comfort after this. They kind of retreat into their own worlds and forget about each other's existence. And this is a great example of how they do not think of each other as a healthy means of emotional reciprocity. They don't reflexively turn to each other in moments of trauma, like, you would hope you'd be able to in a normally functioning relationship. And then, almost to emphasize the staleness of that relationship, we see the first hint at what sets the Swedish commune, the Horga, which is what they're called, apart from Western society, other than, as we'll come to find out, human sacrifice. The last man who jumps from the cliff to kill himself doesn't die on impact with the ground like he is supposed to. He hits the bottom, and then he is sort of choking and gargling in what I can only assume is pretty fucking excruciating pain, and the rest of the Horga start wailing and contorting themselves almost as if to match the man lying at the bottom of the cliff, to like join him in his pain, to be with him there in those terrible few moments before they, walk up and mercy kill him. It's very strange on first watch because you don't really know why they're doing this. It really doesn't become clear until later in the movie. So, after this ritual suicide incident, the characters start getting picked off in typical horror movie fashion, with the cult just kind of doing their thing, murdering people, and then coming up with pretty convincing excuses, actually, for like the people that they haven't killed yet, of why the other people are missing. Like, they're pretty believable. I didn't find myself being like, all right, why did they believe that? But yeah, so unsurprisingly, Danny and Christian are eventually the last foreigners left alive. And although they don't know this, I do think they kind of suspect something fishy is going on. Unfortunately, the couple's reaction to that fishiness is pretty in line with the dynamic of their entire relationship. Danny tries tentatively voicing her very real concerns to Christian, and he just kind of shuts her down, downplaying the seriousness of the situation. I think for the same reason that he doesn't like acknowledging his own emotions, because he doesn't like to admit that he's not in control. Not being in control would mean taking difficult action to regain control, and Christian ain't the biggest fan of difficult action. And since Danny doesn't have the willpower to challenge him, they just stay with the Horga at their mercy. And it's at this point that we're really starting to see exactly how relationships with unhealthy emotional communication can really fuck us when it comes to navigating difficult life situations. Yeah. Eventually, the Horga's plan to take advantage of Danny and Christian's dysfunction comes fully into play. Danny gets roofied with some kind of psychedelic, I'm assuming psilocybin or something. And then they have her compete in this, like, traditional dance competition, which I'm assuming they let her win by, like, giving her a smaller dose than everyone else, maybe. And then they just absolutely shower her with praise and affection and adoration, just making her feel really good. Meanwhile, Christian is off being told by the village matriarch that he has just been selected as an ideal mate for one of the commune's young women. And Christian, our guy Christian, is just kind of like, okay. I think they did a really good job of like showing how he really doesn't know how to react when things are like clearly falling apart around him. He just kind of like when things refuse to obey his delusion that he is in control, he just kind of shuts down and tries to blend in with his surroundings because things have never gotten this out of control for him. So, and then he goes and sees Danny, like, having all this fun and winning her dance competition. And I think because he's freaking out so much internally, he literally willingly drugs himself. Like, this woman just hands him a cup of that she openly tells him has, like, special properties, and he's just like, fuck it, and just downs it, like, right there. And I think it's because he didn't like that he was losing control. And unfortunately for him, that's pretty much the last moment of mental clarity that he ever has. After this, Danny is like paraded around the settlement in a carriage because she is their May Queen, because she like won their big dance competition, and she's like having a lot of fun, drugs and all. Meanwhile, back in Christian Town, Christian is being directed into this barn where he is pretty heavily coerced into having sex with this young woman that the Horga want him to impregnate before they kill him, because, you know, they need like outside genes in order to not let incest just absolutely fuck them with like birth defects. And to be fair to Christian, while it was established earlier in the movie that he was attracted to this girl, or at least like interested in her, I don't think he would have done this sober. I think this is just an example of drugs lowering people's inhibitions. Anyway, the fun thing about this sex scene is that it's actually an orgy. Kind of. No one else is partaking in the sex. But there are a bunch of naked older women from the village surrounding them, smiling and making kind of melodious moaning noises, which are all like synced up with each other and with the young girl who's like having the sex. And some of them are like touching each other. And it's pretty extreme. Like, it can be strange and uncomfortable for a lot of viewers, including myself, just because sex is such a taboo in our modern culture for a lot of different reasons. But honestly, it's a mark of the filmmakers' confidence in their vision that they didn't back down from a scene this like crazy and quirky, because I do think it justifies its presence even without, as they call them in the academy, the boobies, by illustrating once again the very interesting customs these people have around emotional expression and communication. They don't just share each other's pain like we saw with the old man who jumped off the cliff. They also share each other's pleasure, and interestingly, they seem to be making the point here that while negative emotions are diluted by sharing them with the group, positive emotions are actually enhanced, meaning there's really no downside whatsoever to sharing your emotions like this with people who are open to them. So, cut back to Danny after her super fun drug parade. She winds up, coincidentally, near the super fun sex barn and is able to hear the extremely loud moaning of all these women. And so she, quote unquote, disobeys the women that she's with, goes to check it out, and when she sees what's happening in there, she freaks out, she barfs, she starts hyperventilating and crying and just absolute anguish. And I'm guessing there's a lot going on in her mind here. First of all, she's on psychedelics, which tend to enhance pretty much everything going on in your head. Second of all, she just saw pretty much her only emotional crutch left in the world, very publicly, kind of metaphorically saying that he is not hers. I mean, he's having sex with someone else, right? It's probably, she's probably feeling extremely deeply betrayed and abandoned here, and it's kind of like a yeah, obviously moment for the audience, because we already know Christian's a pretty shit boyfriend, but for Danny, who's been ignoring this fact for a very long time and probably hates herself a bit for doing so, it's probably a huge fucking gut punch when that protective wall comes crumbling down and she has no excuse anymore to justify the situation. Her deepest fears are flooding her mind now. She's unworthy of her boyfriend's affection. She asked too much of him and drove him away. She ignored the signs and let this happen to herself. She's broken and not worthy of anyone. These thoughts are probably all swirling in her head, mixing into a stew of sadness and panic and despair that she just isn't able to hide anymore. Probably because of the drugs. That's what psychedelics tend to do. Make it hard to hide your emotions. And then we get probably the best scene in the whole movie, at least my favorite, where like a team of Horga women kind of rush Danny off to a bedroom to try to calm her down. At first, Danny is pretty much, and reasonably so, like, inconsolable, and she just, like, shoves off these women like she doesn't know them. But then one of them manages to kind of take Danny in her arms, and this woman starts to synchronize her breathing with Danny so that they're both kind of hyperventilating with each other at the same speed, just like looking into each other's eyes and hyperventilating with each other. And the other women around them join in, and then they're all kind of yelling/breathing together at the same speed, and all the other women have the same look of anguish on their face as Danny because they're trying to match her. And then Danny lets out a scream, and all the other women let out a scream. And they all scream again and again, and soon they're all screaming at the top of their lungs, but they're doing it together. And you can almost feel as Danny starts to become strengthened by all the women around her, because her crying gets louder, not softer. I think this is because she was starting to feel the sensation of other people truly validating her emotions, something she was mostly a stranger to. Like, acknowledgement that her feelings are real, that other people feel them too, that she is allowed to have them, and feeling emboldened by that, she finally lets loose on her emotions, just expressing them all, not holding them back anymore. And I'm sure that felt amazing to her, to the character of Danny, not Florence Pugh, although that must have been a cool scene to act in for sure. But it must have felt amazing for her to have that kind of support for the first time in such a long time. The movie has a pretty sinister ending after this, despite its wholesome themes. But it's also pretty satisfying in some ways, and that's the point, I'm guessing. Like, basically, So the cult at the end of the movie is getting ready for their annual human sacrifice event, and they give Danny the choice of whether or not Christian, who is still alive, is one of the sacrifices for this event. So they're like, basically they're saying, do you want to kill your boyfriend or not? And it's not completely clear at this point whether Danny is still on drugs here, but I kind of get the impression that she isn't. At this point, I think she's basically just been converted to the cult now, and I don't really have a problem believing that, honestly, because I can see why this commune is so enticing for her. They have sold themselves perfectly. To Danny, these people have given her real emotional connection and empathy, filling the role of family that has been vacant in her life for so long, giving her a means of expressing her grief and anger and fear. And it's arguable that they actually set Christian up to be seen by Danny, like in the barn when he was having sex, in order to facilitate a cleaner break from her past life. Like, they wanted her to have an event that, like, made her want to distance herself from her past life. Because it was kind of questionable before. Like, there were moments where you're like, oh, that seems kind of engineered. Like, they wanted her to show up by the sex barn at that moment. But yeah, I mean, at this point, Danny has already pretty much accepted that Horga is her new home. Now, they're forcing her to choose whether or not she'll be living there with the man who caused her so much unnecessary pain and suffering. For someone in such a raw, vulnerable state as Danny here, I can understand why she ultimately chooses to kill him. This is the first time Danny has felt empowered by her emotions in a very long time. Maybe her whole life, I don't know. And unfortunately, it makes sense that she might be a bit childish in wielding her new power. The Horga have validated every emotional impulse she's had, and they're definitely not gonna stop this one. Like, it's a happy ending and a sad one. Christian burns to death inside of a bear for some reason, with the bodies of all his other friends who were already killed, while the people of Horga watch, screaming, writhing, wailing, as if they too are on fire. The situation makes Danny panic at first, but then she turns and sees the Horga as they join the burning people in their pain, and then she looks back at the fire and starts to smile. And that's the end of the movie. The ending is happy because, you know, Danny finally finds people who can help her process her emotions in a healthy way. We get to see her joy in those last few moments when she finally realizes that she isn't alone in the dark, and that with other people there, the dark is no longer really the dark. But, you know, it's also pretty disturbing depending on how charitably you look at the Horga. At best, her emotional fragility has allowed her to become tied to a group of people whose cultural values include voluntary and unquestioning self-sacrifice, as well as the just unmitigated kidnapping and murdering of any and all foreigners. But, you know, they'll at least make her feel good about herself in the process. But at worst, with the worst possible interpretation of the Horga, she has been expertly emotionally manipulated into joining a death cult, which will soon start coercing her by holding hostage her newfound emotional acceptance. So yeah, depending on how you look at the Horga, it's kind of open to interpretation. Either way, there's definitely a shitty lining to this, what might seem at first glance a happy ending. Now, the director of this movie, Ari Aster, calls this movie a fairy tale. And I can see why. Fairy tales usually attempt to teach people a lesson by showing a worst case scenario of the consequences of disobeying that lesson. And that is definitely what our guy Ari has done here. He is teaching us that good emotional communication is absolutely integral to having a fulfilling life. He has seared that into our brains by giving us the just fucking psychedelic nightmare that is the movie Midsommar. I do love the movie, by the way. I meant psychedelic nightmare in a good way. It's a very good movie. You should go see it. It's a great movie. But yeah, good emotional communication. It's what this movie's all about. But I think there's a little bit more here than just a blanket statement of share your emotions more. Ari Aster has also managed to squeeze in some commentary here about how the kind of emotional communication he's advocating for is very difficult to achieve in our modern world, especially in the West. Danny had to come across some fucking rural Swedish death cult just to find the emotional communication she needed, which is a pretty bold proclamation from Mr. Astor about the state of emotional communication in the modern world. If you want to hear me ramble about my own thoughts and feelings on that subject, I'm very excited to talk about that. Watch part 2. It's what you gotta do. I'll see you around.